far as I can tell, there's been no Australian who's received more consular support in a comparable period than Mr Assange. Since he was arrested in the UK in December 2010, he has been visited by consular officials. They have in turn facilitated a visit for family members. 2 consular officials have been present at each of Mr Assange's court appearances in London. On the day of his release on bail, consular officials made contact with his lawyers. Since that time, consular officials have remained in contact with his legal representatives. When it comes to Sweden, the Australian government has made representations to the Swedish government that due process will be applied to Mr Assange. The principle here is that we don't want Australian citizens involved in the legal system of any other nation to be treated in any way more harshly than citizens of that nation would be treated by the legal system. And we've received assurances to that effect from the Swedish government. We stand ready to offer more consular assistance should he be extradited to Sweden. As I said, I can't find evidence of any other Australian who in a shorter period has received a higher level of consular support from Australian authorities than Mr Assange has. Naturally, we can't intervene in a court case in Sweden, least of all one about allegations, charges of sexual assault, if it in fact comes to that. We know that the Swedes are seeking extradition so that he can be questioned. When it comes to the attitude of the United States, in our exchanges with the Americans, including the ones where I've pointed out to the Americans that he's an Australian citizen and his family are concerned about the prospect of his facing extradition, the Americans have said nothing to indicate an indictment is planned. And certainly there's nothing we've picked up from our contacts with the Americans that an indictment is planned. As a matter of fact, it's no more easy for the United States to extradite someone from Sweden than it is to extradite them from the United Kingdom. So that's just a bit of essential background. The level of consular support is something I'm proud of, and I want to underline. It's the support we give to any Australian who is in a comparable position in the legal system of another country. They can count on consular support regardless of the charge they face or its gravity. And we've made representations to Sweden to see that if he is in fact extradited, if he is in fact charged, he will receive due process.
Have you actually asked the US if they intend to make some extradition application down the track? Have they given you
well, when we've discussed this, and I choose my words carefully because these are private exchanges, nothing the Americans have said have pointed to a planned indictment. We can't tell them what to do when it comes to indicting anyone, but I have made representations on behalf of Mr Assange and his family, pointing out that he's an Australian citizen and his family are concerned about the prospect, but there is no evidence of a US plan to indict him.
Well, we're concerned if the Americans did actually try to indict him or take him from Sweden.
Well, I don't see why they would attempt that, given that there is no difference in the position of Americans attempting an indictment from the United Kingdom and Sweden.
Senator, the government, both during your time and before your time, has been quite outspoken in favour of assistance for convicted drug smugglers in Indonesia, Australian convicted drug smugglers, and yet much less vocal on Julian Assange. Can you understand why people might see that as a contradiction and that suggests that some Australians get more help than others?
No, he's received more help in a shorter time than anyone else I'm aware of. And the help we give is consular assistance. We don't go into court and argue a case for Australians who are accused of a crime in another country. That's not our function. They've got to arrange their own legal defence. It'd be a huge breach of diplomatic practice and of Australian practice abroad to attempt to do that. They receive consular support, and he's received as much as anyone. But when you're talking about people in Indonesia, you're talking about people who've been imprisoned. They're in jail. And 2 of them are facing the death sentence. So naturally we've made representations for clemency. Here you're talking about an argument between the Swedes and an Australian citizen who the Swedes want to question about an alleged sexual assault.
Why has Assange the case been so labour-intensive for the Australians?
Well, because we've got an obligation to help Australians, and because he is there in the court system, but a similar level of investment of time and resources has occurred in China, where Australian citizens have been caught up on commercial matters before the Chinese courts.
The opposition has been critical of comments made by both the Attorney General and the Prime Minister, which seem to presume guilt on the part of Mr Assange. How concerned are you that those sorts of comments coming from the Australian government may prejudice?
I think they would contest that. I haven't seen those comments, but I think they'd be entitled to contest that interpretation. But I noticed I don't think the opposition can be taken too seriously on this. I've argued, I think, with a lot of supporting evidence that we've done everything to provide consular support to Mr Assange. I notice that the opposition is saying we haven't done enough. Well, I just challenge them to nominate what more they think we could have done. As I said, I'm proud to report that in accord with Australian practice, Mr Assange has received as much consular support as we can give to people from the Australian High Commission present during his most recent trial, interaction with his lawyers, a sharing of information, indeed information in the last 2 days on the implications of the court decision that's now been handed down.
I apologise if you've already been asked this, I apologise, but how can you be as confident as you were yesterday in estimates about the United States not having any immediate moves to extradite him from Sweden?
On the evidence available, the United States has said nothing to indicate they're planning an indictment.
Have they said definitively though that they won't? They just said we're not planning it.
We're not responsible for speaking for the US government. And you'll have to talk, I imagine, to the US Justice Department about that. They wouldn't share their intentions with any foreign government. You couldn't expect that. But we've seen nothing to suggest that the Americans are planning any kind of indictment.
Would Australia support or oppose that? Would Australia support or oppose?
That's a hypothetical question.
Well, it's not really. You must have a policy
It is
position.
a hypothetical question.
It's one or the other.
We'd need to see that. But bear in mind the Australian practice. We don't intervene in court cases. We can't. No other government intervenes in court cases concerning consular issues with its citizens abroad. What we do is provide consular support. This has been done in abundance in this case. I'm not apologising for it. I'm proud of it. More consular support than I believe has been given in a comparable time frame to any other Australians who find themselves battling in the legal system of another country. Can I move on to Syria? I'm deeply concerned by new reports by the UN Observer Mission in Syria of 13 shooting victims having been found in Deir al-Zur in the east of the country with bound hands. Taken with what we know happened in Hula, this confirms the new level of gravity with which the world community is dealing. Major General Mood has spoken about the recent revelations as appalling and inexcusable. The UN Security Council met a few hours ago, that's May 30, in New York, and was briefed in closed session on these latest revelations, and all council members spoke out for the need for full implementation of Joint Special Envoy Annan's 6-point plan as the best way forward. Mr Annan will brief the Council on June 7 when he comes to New York to talk about the outcomes of his talks with the Assad government and his attempt to persuade the Assad government to launch a political dialogue with its opponents in Syria. I can announce that Australia has joined the US, the EU and others in calling for a special session of the UN Human Rights Council on Syria on Friday, that is June 1. I'm pleased to see that Turkey and Japan have recently taken similar steps to those we took this week in expelling the 2 Syrian diplomats from Australia. France has indicated plans to host a Friends of Syria meeting to galvanise further international political and humanitarian support, and we're a member. We've pledged substantial humanitarian assistance to the people of Syria. That's worth $11 million. We're considering further support that will flow mostly to the Syrians who are in refugee camps just beyond the borders of their war-ravaged country. I think that probably covers the situation.
Minister,
What's the
given that
indication of
these...
that six-point plan that you spoke about
Yep.
for Syria? Like what are the...
Yeah, the most important, the first point in the plan is for a cessation of hostilities. That means a ceasefire that involves the withdrawal of heavy weaponry from built-up areas. When that's in place, there can be a climate where opponents of the regime can emerge and begin taking the next step, and that is a dialogue with the government, ideally one that's directed towards a transition in power that sees Mr Assad move aside for another figure who can head an interim government and plan elections like those that are taking place now in Egypt. But we need the ceasefire first. The ceasefire and the dialogue come before everything else. There's agreement in the UN, divided as it is on other approaches. There is agreement on the Annan plan with that ceasefire as the first of the 6 points.
Are
Minister,
there any
what's the
plans to
latest?
invite Aung San Suu Kyi to Australia at all? Since they can
Look, I'm going to talk about that in Burma. I want to issue an invitation for all of you to join me in Yangon on Tuesday.
Minister, what's the latest on the status of the Syrian charge and his colleague? Have they left yet, or do you know when they...
I need to get advice on that. As you know, we gave them 72 hours. I'll make a calculation and get you a report.
So
Minister,
what would you say on
given-
Tuesday? Did you say you will be inviting them?
We're still looking at prospects there. I'll talk to you in Yangon on Tuesday about that, and I'm serious about you coming.
Just back on Syria, given the incidents like the one you've just outlined are still occurring or seem to still be occurring, what practical good has it done to expel diplomats? Not just our decision, but other countries' decision.
Well,
Aren't they coming their nose at us?
the alternative for us and other nations, the alternative to expelling diplomats would be to leave that undone and not to have sent any sort of message. There is some hope in what I've read about members of the Syrian government around Assad realising how isolated they have become. If it has one practical effect, it might be to confirm to people in the Assad government, if not the Assad family itself, that their country is increasingly isolated and really exists under a cloud of opprobrium as the world community sees it.
Do you think neighbouring...
Remember what happened in Libya? There was a shearing away from the Gaddafi regime of elements of the military and political leadership. We haven't seen signs of that in Damascus. There's a more cohesive group around the president. But if the expulsion of diplomats sends a message to some people in the leadership that their country is isolated, it will have been worthwhile.
Is there a role for the countries surrounding Syria to do more than they are doing now?
They've got a lot of problems. I think the burden of a huge refugee flow is being felt in Lebanon, in Turkey and in Jordan. I think it would be a little unkind for us to criticise them or up the ante. They're facing a lot of pressure. They deserve our understanding. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the Foreign Affairs Minister Bob Carr live from Canberra, insisting WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has received as much consular assistance as anyone else in a similar situation. Mr Assange lost that appeal overnight in the UK against an extradition order to Sweden to face sexual assault charges. Mr Assange's supporters have said the Australian government should seek an assurance from the United States that it will not prosecute him. They're concerned Assange could end up facing a lengthy term in the US, lengthy jail term in the US over charges in relation to revealing state secrets. But Bob Carr says the US has said nothing to indicate an indictment is planned against Julian Assange. And he also insists that Australia can't tell the Americans what to do when it comes to indicting anyone. So that's in contradiction to what Jennifer Robertson, Mr Assange's who's part of Mr Assange's legal team, said earlier today. Bob Carr was also mentioning there the ongoing efforts to secure a genuine ceasefire in Syria.